throws out these accusations of fake news. And it seems to me that what's going on here is very simple. It's simply trying to discredit a report, a story, without having to explain why it should be discredited, right? It's as if, you know, the accusation itself is sufficient. And the other way in which I think, you know, it was used was in stories about fake news websites, right? So, you know, we heard a lot around the election about, you know, people who've been paid, many writing from outside of the country, who are being paid to write stories simply to maximize clicks, maximize income, money, by writing these sort of fantastic stories that in many cases couldn't possibly be true, but because of the gullibility of the general public, we were reading them, we were sharing them on social media. It seems to me, this is the distinction that was very much, you know, sort of in the spotlight at that time of the election. And what I want to focus on today is sort of the latter of the two. You know, in terms of using the fake history label to challenge all news stories, that is certainly troubling. It certainly overlaps with what I want to talk about today. I think most importantly, it challenges the very idea of truth when it comes to being able to digest and read through information and think about evidence and think about argument and all of that. So, you know, I want to talk about the issue of websites as vehicles for information. And I want to start with this quote. It happens to be the first sentence from a piece that I wrote for Smithsonian back in December. You can read it for yourself. It's something that I have used in the classroom over and over, just to sort of remind students of the dangers of, you know, of the internet, of how we use the internet. And one of the things that struck me from this discussion, just, you know, very raw public discussion that we had, was that it reminded me that we really haven't done much to sort of educate people about how to use the internet, right? And I think probably many of you will agree that this does capture sort of the dangers of, you know, unquestioningly, you know, using or logging onto the internet, a website, reading through and accepting what it, you know, what is presented. And it seems to me that as teachers, we have an obligation to, you know, to educate our students about, you know, how to most effectively navigate the internet, how to assess websites. And so the next slide is sort of the world that, you know, I've straddled as a historian or as a teacher, as a history educator. So Andy, if you can go to the next slide, that'd be great. I mean, I think for many of us, you know, this is the world that we've straddled, right? You know, when I was in school for the first part of my teaching career, students got information through those things called books, right? I think the image on the left should look familiar to most of you. And, you know, there was sort of a benefit to that, looking back on it. You know, there was a certain amount of quality control. I remember every spring, my librarian would contact me and ask, well, what books do you want us to order for next year? You know, in various categories. And I think what was going on there was, you know, that history teachers, librarians were being used to vet the information that our students have access to for various assignments. Most importantly, perhaps, when it comes to writing, you know, the classic, you know, history essay or history book report. And so it seems to me that, you know, that there was a benefit to having the stacks as the vehicle for various history assignments. At the same time, of course, it was incredibly limiting, right? Students had access mainly to secondary sources. In other words, the work of other historians, very little access to primary documents before the age of the internet. Just think of all the databases from places like the Library of Congress, et cetera. Students now have access to those primary sources. That's an incredible wealth of information and allow students for themselves to be their own historians. But that's not the world that they occupy now, right? Information is everywhere. And, you know, I think for the most part, what I've seen is that we are sending our students into the forest without any guidance. And that is sort of the connection for me with the fake news sort of story. It's that as history educators, we've been dealing with this, right? If we're really tuned into how our students are getting information, how they're assessing information, this problem that emerged around the election is really nothing new. It just sort of clarified, again, for me, the problem that we're not doing enough. And I think part of that is also that as teachers, maybe we haven't ourselves learned basic rules of how to, you know, how to navigate the internet. So Andy, if you go to the next slide. And for me, the problem it became crystal clear in the early 2000s. You know, I was the kind of teacher who every year I would ask students to write, you know, the long research essay. They could choose a topic of interest. And I remember one student, intelligent student, who decided he wanted to write a paper about the Ku Klux Klan. And, you know, at that time, the internet was first beginning to come into play in terms of, you know, its use as a source for information. And, you know, I remember reading the paper in the end, and I remember thinking to myself, there is something seriously wrong with this essay in terms of just basic facts, basic interpretation. And, you know, of course, at the end, when I was sort of inquiring into the, you know, the types of sources, or I was looking at the bibliography, I saw a number of websites that were websites published by the Ku Klux Klan. Now, you know, I could have, you know, I guess maybe the instinct would have been to sort of blame the student, but of course that would have been unjustified because I had done very little, if anything, to educate my students on what kinds of websites to sort of use and what kinds of websites to steer clear of. And so that really, for the first time, was the trigger for me to begin to think more critically about what we can do in the classroom to make this, I guess, to sort of maximize the potential of the internet, because of course there is an incredible wealth of information that should be used. So if you forward it, Andy, sorry for this approach.
That's all right. So I think we have a poll question coming up.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I missed an opportunity. So do you want to read it, or should I read it, or?
So this is attached to slide 20. The question says, does this story resonate in your classroom? Is that the correct poll question?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so I'm going to launch this now. So for our participants, again, welcome to our experiment. We are going to launch what I think is the first live poll ever done in the American Class webinar series. I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to respond. When I launch this, you should be able to see, starting right now, a question. It's a yes or no question, and as you register your thoughts, then we will see, I'm seeing the live results immediately. In a moment, at the end of 30 seconds, I'm going to turn the poll off, and I'm going to tell you the results.
So while you guys are taking or responding to the poll, I'll just sort of...
Elizabeth's asking a good question to clarify. It's the story about the KKK paper.
Yeah.
The question does need to be more specific, but you're right. Yes, Elizabeth, I think that's, so it's this notion of providing resources in the digital environment that have not been vetted in the proper way. Is that correct, Kevin?
Yes, yes.
Okay. All right, 10 more seconds, 10 more seconds. Let's go with 5, actually. This is real time, not teacher time. 5 more seconds. And I'm going to close the poll now. And the results are going to be shared there.
So it's not a problem then.
Thank you.
Great. So you know, it's always nice to know that I'm not alone. So just to sort of wrap up this first little section of my presentation before we move on to Ben, I think there's a balance here. I think there's both, you know, that the internet is both a blessing and a curse. Again, as I mentioned, you know, just providing students access to historical documents, you know, things that will never make it into your textbook. Think of the way in which our history textbooks, they all sort of blend together, right? I mean, you're essentially getting the same narrative, right? You're going to meet the same people. But I mean, when we're talking about moving beyond the textbook, when we're thinking about the kinds of, the kinds of texts and the kinds of narratives that you can find on the internet, it expands in so many ways, just the subject matter, but also the documents themselves. And I think the most important thing about it is, again, and this was always important for my classroom. I wanted my students to learn how to think like historians. I wanted my students not just to read history, but to be able to think critically about it and to start learning how to construct their own interpretations. And of course, part of that, involves being able to evaluate sources, and obviously that's going to connect to, to the whole issue of how to evaluate websites. And then the last thing is that it's not just that students have the opportunity to produce, their own history, but as I'll mention at the end, it's also that students have an opportunity to produce history for the public. That's never been the case before, whether it's a YouTube video, whether it's on a blog, whether it's on a traditional website. That is that's incredibly powerful in terms of, how we ask our students to see themselves as students of history or as historians. So next slide, Andy.
So before you do, Kevin, I'm going to point out something that Jennifer A. just noted. I'm going to share the results of the poll again. Do you see the results now?
Yeah.
Yeah, so 97% yes, 6% no, for a grand total of 103%. So we'll have to investigate how we take this polling data, but it's been artfully responded. It's fake polls, Jennifer, thank you.
Yeah.
We'll have to investigate why that poll worked out that way. Thank you.
Yeah. And I think just the obvious points on the flip side that I've sort of already referenced, that the technology, has outpaced educators. There is, I guess you could say, too much information out there. It's impossible to keep track of it all. Students, and I think the general public, overall, we approach the internet as sponges. We do very little evaluation when we go and search for information. And I think the extreme of that is that there's the danger of treating all information as equal, right? There's also the danger of just undercutting any notion of truth in this sphere. And then just sort of piggybacking on the last point that I made on the last slide, students can, of course, produce history for the general public in various ways, but they may not have a sense of what responsibilities are involved in doing so. And that's also something that I want to briefly touch on at the end in my last section. So with that, I'll sort of hand it over to Ben.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Andy. And first of all, hello, everybody, and good evening as it is. And thank you so much for this session after a long, hard day's teaching. I want to just move on from that sort of very eloquent introduction that Kevin has given us, and to move into this sort of the next section of our seminar this evening, which is to spend a little bit of time, not a great deal, on just considering the phenomenon of fake news itself, and to see where we think it maybe sits with the phenomenon of history and historical knowledge, and indeed, fake historical time, and also just where does it sit with our role as educators generally, and history educators specifically. I think that there's a couple of issues that are worth considering. I mean, first of all, Kevin's already sort of introduced the notion, and I think Andy did as well, about fake news. And I think it's worth just dwelling for a moment of time to consider exactly what that means. Maybe we'll all have our own separate definitions of that. But it would be interesting maybe if anybody wanted to just sort of get into the chat box and give me an example of some fake news that they've seen today or in the last couple of days, or an account or report that they consider to be fake news. Can anybody offer us anything in the chat box?
So Ben, let's take a pause for a moment and get this chat box working. And so the invitation to the entire group is to note something that you might consider fake news that you've run across recently. Be sure to open this up to everybody, to everyone when you do your chat. And we would love to see some of your thoughts. There's Elizabeth chiming in that Sandy Hook was a false flag.
Oh, yeah.
Susie Quintero, why has no one ever asked why the Civil War happened? Of course, that's a quote from President Trump recently. There are forensics, truth, and personal truth. And there's Rebecca Graff, who's daring me to say this out loud, dihydrogen monoxide. Religious-based news by Sarah, Sandra, Pizzagate. Yeah, absolutely, Pizzagate.
So, okay.
A lot of these have U.S. sort of themes here, but I would imagine in UK, you at least know the illusions.
Oh, no, we don't have fake news in the UK.
No.
Everybody's just so cynical and switched on.
What I mean is, you know what Pizzagate is and Sandy Hook, et cetera, correct?
I do indeed. I mean, yeah. Sandy Hook is interesting in particular. I mean, as an incredibly emotionally sort of draining issue, and a way in which, again, it sort of reminds us of the slippery nature of such issues as fake news, where this is, I don't know if it's unique, but it's certainly unusual in the sense of an attempt to unmake a real piece of news. That I think is something that will probably resonate with many historians. It's actually sort of isn't, if you like, might be considered the same thing as the mainstream fake news, if such a term isn't too absurd. As I say, I think we're all seeing that there's an issue here that we're concerned about. The fact that we're here discussing it, I think, is important and significant as well. I think if we then consider another question, is it actually anything new? History teachers have as their kind of meat and drink the idea of accounts which are one-sided or biased, or so is it as simple as just carrying on teaching history with an analytical approach, or is there's something sort of different and new about this bias? Now, actually, is based on the assumption that there is something new. Well, okay, partly new. I mean, what did you expect from a historian? You're never going to get a straight answer. But I think that the thing that is different and that is new is this conscious construction of a body of information, which is deliberately designed to push attention, but actually has no partisan basis, for example, has no ideological basis. It is purely a commercial, and that's what the internet service providers, for example, that's what they tend to see more as the sort of working definition that they're using of fake news. And I do think this is an extremely important issue for us as educators, and not just as historians. It goes right to the heart of how education generally works, and I think how history teaching works as well. This idea that people are, if you like, magnetized. They will gravitate towards areas, and what fake news is doing in many cases is actually just increasing the level of magnetism, if you like, in order to inform. And I again, I take the point in some of the chat box comments that are coming up about the Levin fake. But I think what is comparatively new about this is it's almost the nihilistic nature of it, a complete disregard for the purpose, for any kind of ideological or sort of ontological basis for it to be there. And I think on the next slide here, which is several of you have already brought up the whole question of Conway and alternative facts. And I think the fascinating thing about this one is these two articles were both produced by the same. Oh, hang on, somebody's moving me forward.
Sorry about that, Jim.
Okay, these two articles are produced by the same news outlet. Absolutely the same. One is called Liberal Society and the other is called Conservative 101. So there is absolutely no, if you like, moral basis or even immoral basis to this notion of what's going on. Traffic is now the aim. It is not about influencing. It is not about changing opinion. It is not about trying to achieve a particular notion, a particular sort of political handle or economic argument or anything of that sort. It is exactly like what will wind people up, what will actually get them in sort of to click on this, because we get advertising revenue as a result. Now, I do that to some extent is new in two different ways. One is, as I've said before, the difficulty of locating the ideological roots of this type of material. And the second is the vulnerability of people to this if their kind of intellectual radar, if you like, is not sufficiently tuned in. Now, I want to try and illustrate this point really with a historical perspective, which is this is something that comes from the New York Sun in 1835, and it shows the creatures who allegedly live them. He's my favorite, but I quite like the sort of the giraffe with ibex horns. But as you can see, the moon is highly populated at this point in time. Now, the interesting one about this particular example is that the New York Sun published this fake news in inverted commas, a set of scientists and thinkers who argued that there's some life on the moon and civilizations. And hold on there, that's it. And so, but strangely enough, the public, when they got hold of this, assumed that it was correct. So it was published in order to make fun of a notion, and it ended up reinforcing that notion. But I think that this is the difference, is that this original part of fake news had a clear intellectual and ideological position. Okay, it all went horribly wrong, but it still did that. And I think that this possible, using historical perspectives on fake news is a way that we might be able to get our students to think a little bit about the nature of fake news, about particularly the lack of a kind of moral or ideological basis that fake news actually has. So it's not really asking us to do anything different as a story, and it's an opportunity to have some fun with source material that we might not normally use. But it's also an important perspective to show that in some respects, at least, I think that fake news is a new phenomenon. Okay, so in contribution, and obviously, as history educators, we're here to look more closely at the implications of all of this for history teachers and the opportunities as well, of course.
Hey, Ben.
So I'm now going to hand back over to Kevin. Oh, sorry.
Hey, Ben, before you go,
yep.
And again, I really do appreciate everybody working hard with us in terms of being patient with this new platform, and that includes Ben and Kevin and Libby. But I do want to take a moment. It's nice to have this back and forth, but there are a lot of questions that are queuing up for you, Ben, and I want to give you a second to respond to some of them before we go to Kevin. And I'm particularly looking at Val, who asks, is propaganda fake news or an attempt to predict the future? What do you think of that?
I'm not sure that I would see. I think one of the things with propaganda, the way in which I'm differentiating it, and I appreciate that you might you might not accept my definition or agree with it or want to work with it. But I believe that the propaganda is not fake news because it has this ideological base. And I would argue that with the right tools, it's it's easier to defend against in a kind of rational world. So I don't see propaganda, on the whole, the kind of fake news we're talking about that is purely commercially motivated, I would suggest is not propaganda because it's not politically or ideologically.
So Ben, let me follow up then with some other comments from Val, and Kevin has weighed in as well. I'll give you two different questions to maybe continue that train of thought. One is fake news all fake? And secondly, is yellow journalism fake news?
Yeah, you're going to have to enlighten me on yellow journalism.
Okay, we'll let Kevin take that one. How about just fake news? Do you think it's 100% fake? Is it a either or? Is it a binary?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So yellow journalism, we're going back to that period right before the Spanish-American War, and there were a number of newspapers that were pushing for war with Spain. So this is that period where America is becoming a world power, and there were a number of stories published about atrocities committed against the Cuban people by the Spanish, and this was supposed to outrage the American people and lead to a declaration of war. So I wonder, it seems to me, many of these stories were just, were fantasy. They were, I guess you could call them, you might call them fake news, certainly ideological in the sense that they were, part of a concerted movement to push a certain kind of American foreign policy, also based on a kind of social Darwinism at the time. And I guess also designed to predict the future or to shape the future, if you will. So I don't know if that helps, but that's a good question.
Thanks, Kevin, for taking that. Kevin, try your own mouse right now to see if you can advance the slide. Just click the screen anywhere. There you go.
Oh, I think we got it. Hold on.
All right. Now you got to go back now. You're going.
Okay, I went the wrong way. I gave it all up. Sorry.
Hold on, Kevin. You're doing that thing that we all do. We're pushing the elevator button 100 times.
Yeah.
All right, just take your hand off the mouse for a second.
I did. My hands are in the air.
Yeah, walk slowly away. All right.
So on the right-hand side or the left-hand side?
It's in the lower left-hand corner.
Lower left-hand corner. Okay. So, all right. We'll see what happens.
All right.
Okay. So this is really interesting. I'm really enjoying this. One of the things that Ben is sort of getting at that I think is really important is that, and I think this is a way in which our presentations overlap, is again that this question of bias, this question of truth in terms of how we think about source material is nothing new, whether it's the internet or whether or not it's a page from the New York Sun. So I like the way in which our presentations are sort of blending together. So I wanted to take a few minutes to give you a kind of quick case study. And this is a case study that I've spent a good deal of time with. I've been writing about this issue. I am a Civil War historian. And I've been writing about this myth of the Black Confederate soldier for close to a decade now. And I'm close to finishing a book, according to the publisher, by August, but we'll see about that. And this is also a way in which, my work as a historian sort of also connects with my time in the classroom. I think it's a great example of the dangers that we face when we approach the internet as sponges, when we're just absorbing things rather than questioning them, questioning the sources. So this image, of course, it's a very popular image. It depicts what appear to be two soldiers in uniform. If you were to look closely, they're both wearing gray uniforms. They're both in Confederate uniforms. And this is, for many people, this is all the proof they need, whether it comes in the form of a book, but especially on a website, that any number from 1,000 to 100,000 Black men, slaves, free Blacks, fought as soldiers, as equals in the Confederate Army. And see if we can advance it here. Yeah, it's still not advancing.
I'll do it for you, Kevin.
Sorry.
All right.
So you'll find these images, all over the internet. And I'm not going to give you a sort of in-depth history, lesson here about the Black Confederate soldier. But again, the claim is roughly this: that anywhere between 1,000 and 100,000, that alone should sound bizarre to all of you, served as soldiers in the Confederate Army. It's a myth. It is a myth that I've pinpointed to about 1977 in response to the success of the television series Roots. And it's a myth that actually serves a certain purpose. And I think when we're talking about myths in history, we're talking about sort of those kind of historical narratives that are the most distorted, either in print or online. They are usually those narratives that have to do with sort of issues that connect to the present, right? So right now, of course, we're at a time when we're dealing with the issue of race. And so any kind of historical narrative that connects with that is likely to be manipulated. And this is one of those stories that's been manipulated for those purposes, to serve some kind of present purpose. And the myth is designed to do a couple things. Overall, it's designed to show that African Americans supported the Confederate war effort, right? That they were actually side by side, whether it was on the home front or in the Army itself, brandishing a weapon and shooting down those evil Yankee soldiers. There's also claims that these men, sort of as veterans, received pensions for their service after the war. But the overall purpose of this claim is to make or reinforce a fundamental point that many people I would say, who have Confederate ancestors, who have an interest in sort of pushing back against our increased focus on the Civil War as the moment of emancipation. The pushback is that slavery, that the preservation of white supremacy was not the central goal of the Confederate war effort, right? And those of you who are teaching US history, your textbook, hopefully what you're doing in your classroom right now is sort of emphasizing the importance of emancipation as an outcome to the Civil War. And you're probably also focusing on the service of roughly 200,000 African-American soldiers who fought in the United States Army to preserve the Union and end slavery. This narrative is designed to push back on that, to say, okay, that may have happened, but the Confederacy was also at the forefront of racial justice, if you will. And this is a narrative that lives, that has spread throughout the internet over the last 15 years. So go ahead, Andy.
Okay.
And so if you were just to, pull up your Google, your search engine, and look for stories, this may be how many of you would go about it. If you heard that Black men or Black Confederates existed, you might go to the internet and look for information on this subject. And if you were to do that, at least as of last week, if you were just to punch in those two keywords, Black Confederates, you would find somewhere around 548,000 results, right? You would get at the top an article in The Root, which is published by Henry Louis Gates from Harvard. You would find news items, encyclopedia entries, and you would find a host of .com sites that sort of, in one way or another, sort of address this issue. If you forward to the next slide, you could also perhaps do an image search, right? You might actually be curious. Well, what do these Black men look like, right? What does a Black Confederate look like? And of course, you can see on this results page, you're going to see the image that I showed you on the first page. The image, I should have identified that image. That image is on the left, Andrew Chandler and Silas Chandler. On the right, the Black man. And it was an image taken probably in 1861. It's a studio photograph, so it was probably staged. And what we know about Silas is that he was enslaved to the Chandler family until the very end of the war. So he was never a soldier in the Confederate Army. He was a slave. He was Andrew Chandler's personal body servant, what I call his camp slave. And there were thousands of these men who were in the Army in uniform, serving as servants, if you will, for their masters. It was an extension of slavery. But if you look at this image, you'll also see another image that appears more than once, a group of soldiers. And if you look closely, the photograph is even identified. It says the 1st Louisiana Native Guard. And if you sort of forward to the next slide, this is one of the most popular images on the internet. And, you know, again, if you were just to approach the internet without questioning anything about the source, the website itself, you might think, well, I mean, they appear to wear gray uniforms. They're brandishing weapons. They're holding weapons. There's your proof. They're from Louisiana. It's 1861. But if you actually were to cut and paste the link that I provided at the top, there's a backstory to this image. It is a wonderful example of the dangers of using the internet, without question, and that is, it's a photoshopped image. The image first was a colored lithograph that appeared in 1863 out of Philadelphia. It was a lithograph that was used to recruit Union soldiers. So these men are actually Union soldiers from Pennsylvania. What has been cropped out from both sides are their company officers. So they've been cropped out. And the colored lithograph was eventually was based on a photograph, and that was taken of the same group of men. And eventually, at some point, it was turned into an image. They did some work on the color, and so someone decided to turn these men into Black Confederate soldiers. So this is sort of a wonderful example of again, I guess the obvious point to make again is what happens when we just sort of, you know, search without thinking about maybe the keywords that we're using, how we go about searching, and how we go about assessing the sources themselves. So if you can sort of advance, Andy, to the next one. And so this is sort of for me, it's the ultimate horror story, and it should be it should be a horror story, I think, for all of us. And I think it also sort of makes the point that, again, this isn't a problem for our students. This is a problem for all of us. And in 2009, I was still living in Virginia. A story appeared having to do with a new Virginia textbook, specifically for the 4th grade. And the author, Joy Masoff, she works for this Five Ponds Press. She writes textbooks in science, a number of other subjects, but she also writes their history textbooks. And this is a book that all Virginia kids were using, at least this year, or in 2009. And in the section on the Civil War, you can see it for yourselves. She claims thousands of Southern Blacks fought in Confederate ranks, including 2 battalions under the command of Stonewall Jackson. You can imagine sort of the surprise, at least from among the academic historians, all of whom came out and said unequivocally, there is no evidence for this. But I guess eventually, and what I wasn't surprised by was learning that the information was pulled from a Google search, right? She had plugged in Black Confederates, and she had come across a website. It was a website published by the Sons of Confederate Veterans, a Confederate heritage organization that has an interest in pushing this narrative. And that is where the information was pulled from. So, you know, in my mind, it's a wonderful example of the ways in which, you know, even the sources that we're using in our classrooms are problematic in certain ways, depending on who's writing them. But again, it also, I think, reinforces the point that this is a problem that extends beyond simply our students. In the classroom, this is more a problem for how we generally are using the internet. So Andy, if you can go, I think that might be. Yeah, I think that's the end of that section. So what I'll come back to a little bit later on is just some quick and easy ways in which we can address this problem in the classroom. The nice thing about this is not rocket science. It seems to me that sort of impressing upon our students 5 basic questions about when we come across a website is going to make all the difference in the world. So we'll talk about that when I come back a little bit later. It's all yours, Ben.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. Yeah, as Kevin's just said, we're just going to ponder for a little while the issue of, I guess, what you might call historical mindsets or the lack of them, with regard to this idea of why students are potentially vulnerable, or indeed, not just school students but adults as well. And I think this maybe opens up some possibilities, some chinks in the armor of fake news that we as teachers might be able to exploit. I think it's worth looking at this first question. There we go. And I think that one of the things that makes students vulnerable to fake news and fake history is kind of what Kevin was alluding to. I just went backwards. Did I mean to? Is that you, Andy? That's good. Which is this idea of retrieval culture. I don't know whether anybody got the chance to read any of the pieces, but I've just sort of written a chapter on this. Someone's messing with my presentation. Behave. We good? Yeah. Yeah. So some of the things I think is what I've characterized as retrieval culture. And what I mean by this is a mindset that I think many students adopt, despite our best efforts, in which they regard their job first and foremost as to just go and find things. The teacher says the topic is this. The teacher says the question is this. Okay, I go and find things. It might be in a book. It might be off a presentation. It might be from a website. But that, I think, is what is incredibly damaging to critical thinking, which is that almost by default, students, I think, don't see that as their job. It doesn't even cross their radar. They see it as, my job in school is to have things and write them down and maybe report them back again in some kind of paper or something of that. And I think that it's something that we can do to try and sort of open those ideas up. There's, again, a few sort of clips and links and articles that we'll be making available. And certainly in the UK, we had one very sort of interesting incident when groups of 13, 14 were asked to look at a number of websites, and one of them was a Holocaust denial site. And there's this one kid on this. Sorry, this is a TV program. And this one kid actually says to the teacher who's asked them to look at the site, the teacher asks, "What's the main message of this site?" And the kid says that there wasn't, and he pauses, that there wasn't a Holocaust. And the interesting thing at that moment is that this kid knows that's not right, and yet it's there on screen in front of him. So it must be right. And you can see, the teacher wouldn't have asked me to look at this stuff. Yeah. Now, obviously, we as teachers don't ask them to look at fake news and fake history. But from a student's point of view, if we ask them to look at a topic and they Google it, then, sometimes that line gets a bit blurred. So I think this whole idea of retrieval culture, I think if we can say to them, look, it isn't just about finding any old information. It is about thinking about that information once it's arrived, positioning it against what you already know. As certain techniques that Kevin's going to talk about a bit later. There's another factor, I think, which makes us vulnerable to fake news and fake history, and that is now I've clicked. I don't know whether we've got a delay or.
There it is.
Okay. Yeah. Is this idea of binary thinking. So, for many students, again, my first job is I just go and find things out. The more stuff I find out, the better. Okay. The second is this idea that information is just information. It's either right or it's wrong. There's no sort of nuance in there. The sole purpose of this, from the student's point of view, is the acquisition of correct or accurate, what we call substantive knowledge. And when we talk about substantive knowledge, it's worth sort of qualifying that by differentiating it from disciplinary knowledge. So in that sense, substantive knowledge is accurate and correct factual information and understanding of concepts like revolution or civil war or something like that. But of course, disciplinary knowledge is also about the way in which that knowledge can be deployed to make an argument. And for many of our students, the acquisition of substantive knowledge is not such a big problem, whereas deployment of disciplinary knowledge is trickier. I'm hoping we've got a poll here now, have we, Andy?
We do, and
Yep.
as a matter of fact, unfortunately, we missed a couple of opportunities for polls. So,
Oh no, go back.
sorry.
Okay, poll here, please.
Hold on, just bear with me. Okay, okay, team. We are about to launch another poll. Which of these answers represents
So,
the most
of a
sophisticated-
document published.
Ben?
Yeah, that's it.
Okay. Can you see the poll?
And I can't see it. Oh, here it is. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, team attendees, please register your thoughts. Which of the following answers represents the most sophisticated historical thinking? And again, I'll give you about 30 seconds to reply. It will be truth. It will be total lies. It will be true, but we'll select the bits of truth which suits. I'd better read it and see what it says, or something else.
If you say something else, we're going to hunt you down and make you explain what it is, the something else.
Okay, just about 15 more seconds. Please chime in. We would love to get your feedback.
So basically, I asked a bunch of 15, 16-year-olds to look at this cover. It's from a British document, should we say, about German outrages in the First World War. So it was published around about 1917.
Okay, 2 more seconds, and the poll is closed. Okay, Ben, I'm now going to publish the results of the poll.
If you would, please.
And I'm going to share them. Can you see the results?
Okay, so we're getting a comforting majority with, they think it'll be true, but it will probably select bits of truth which suit the authors. Yeah. Now that's a typical historian's view, isn't it? Propaganda is very rarely wrong. It's very rarely incorrect. The clever thing about propaganda is to select the bits of truth that support the proposition that you're putting forward. And that is, that's quite a complex idea. And for many of our students, of course, they find that difficult. So this is, more or less what I expected from a bunch of history teachers for this particular poll. I asked the same questions, as you can see, from a bunch of 15, 16-year-olds in England. And we used clickers, the voting handset things. And I asked them to sort of, to see what they thought what their answers were. If I move forward, then I'm not quite sure whether there's a delay. I click forward. There we go.
I would say click it and just be patient. There might be a little delay.
Yeah. And this is what those students, I think it's quite illuminating that not one of them said, I better go and read it and see what it says. That was a real eye opener for me, to sort of see that essentially, this is binary thinking in action. That stuff is either true or false. There's nothing in between. And unless I have a really good reason for assuming it's false, it's going to be true. You know, I think this can be a very, very powerful way. And well, I thank you to those of you who are sort of asking or raising points about this. But the idea obviously is applicable to lots and lots of material and lots of different ways. Some of you may have come across the martinlutherking.org site, which purports to tell you the historical truth about Martin Luther King, and is in fact published by Stormfront, which is a white supremacist organization. You know, this I think is the kind of thing that students will be, you know, bumping into. So I think that, yeah, you know, the idea of you know, getting them to think about the nature of the material that's in front of them, you know, to think before they start reading it, before they start accessing it, what they think they're looking for. This can be a you know, a useful and informative exercise. So we've seen the you know, we've got this idea of the retrieval culture, and we've got this problem of binary thinking. You know, both of those things leave us vulnerable, leave our students vulnerable. But at the same time, if we flag them up, I think that you know, if we can actually start using the words in the classroom, hey, come on, that's binary thinking, or come on, you know, that's retrieval. You're not actually thinking about what you've retrieved. Now, another area is confirmation bias. So, and I'm just going to show you a couple of examples of this. Here's my first one, which involves some medieval women. Can I have some suggestions? Can anybody just type in what can you see they're doing? No trick question here, I promise.
This is your forensics truth, Ben. What are they doing?
Yeah.
Val says ritual. Val, thank you, Val. You, for some reason, are in the all panelists. Rashid, I see that you've raised your hand. If you can, go ahead and type.
Ritual's good. I think.
There it is, reading.
Yeah, certainly the woman reading is likely to be reading a religious text. And I don't know, Val, how familiar you are with this, but it was a very common thing in medieval times for women to work in groups like this, and one of them would read from a prayer book or obviously from the Bible. And yeah, somebody's picked up on needlepoint, which is the woman furthest away from us. I think we've got some basket work going on to the woman on our right-hand side, sort of nearest to us. And if anyone can tell me what the woman in the middle is doing, I'd be grateful. I'm guessing, for me, I'm thinking it might be spinning, where she's actually sort of threading out. So you can see, you know, okay, here's a medieval scene, and fine, okay. I'm now going to move on a slide. And you can then zoom out a little bit, hopefully. Okay, and can I ask for some thoughts, some speculation about what do you think? You know, we've seen what these women on the left are doing. What do you think the two on the right are doing? Just, you know, any random thoughts in the textbook. So we've got making lace might be the earlier one. We've got plucking a chicken. That's very promising. Washing, yeah, we've got some gardening. More chicken plucking. Dyeing cloth.
There's always more chicken plucking, Ben.
I was trying to get the rhythm right. I know I can't do the accent. Oh, stuffing pillows. All right, so we're maybe getting closer. Strangely enough, though, none of you suggested bricklaying. And I think it's an interesting example here, isn't it, of this kind of source, which is of confirmation bias. We actually, you know, we have to ask ourselves, how far were we actually looking at the source? And how far were we really looking for things that confirmed things we already knew? Yeah, we didn't find it too hard to pick out all of these domestic things going on the left-hand side, because most of the women did the kind of sewing and all that kind of stuff. The bricklaying thing was pretty left field, and I think, as I say, it's a good example of confirmation bias. And I think, again, it's something that makes us vulnerable to fake history and fake news. If you don't actually look at what's in front of you, but instead you look for things that confirm that you already know, then you're going to be vulnerable to the message, and especially when somebody clever is creating the thing in the first place. Another thought, I don't know how familiar you are with the Battle of the Somme, but it's probably, in sort of cultural terms, it probably occupies in the British consciousness, a similar kind of significance to say Gettysburg or something like that. And yet you see this advertisement here from the early stages of the Battle of the Somme, where this local store is saying, "My word, there's Somme sale going on at Chelten's, great slaughter of prices in all departments." You might feel that this is a little bit tasteless. Certainly when most British people look at this, they just can't believe it. They're open-mouthed. But it brings it home to us again that the past is foreign countries to some extent, and some of these other places are foreign countries. There are different systems. This is a very good example of something that helps us to challenge confirmation bias, and I'm sure you'll be able to find similar ones for people that throw off their comfortable rails and make them realize that actually the past isn't just the sort of the nice packaged version that we sometimes get, or certainly sometimes that we would rather see. And so I just took this particular part of the session. I'm saying that one of the things that maybe we can do as educators is to go a little bit further. Many of you may have used the Weinberg and the Stanford Group model of reading and using documents and that sort of thing. My own humble opinion here is that I just don't think it goes enough, because it's predicated on retrieval or binary thinking. Most of the work, this is a series of documents on Chamberlain and appeasement. Now, we haven't got time to work our way through all of these, but you'll have access to the presentation, and it's worth looking at them and asking yourself, actually, why did we bother with a document for any of these? These are all textbook type questions. And so, if we are going to look at historical documents, I think are the potential training ground for getting our students much more attuned to being critical and analytical about source material, like fake news, like fake history, but not if we just use documents the same way we use textbooks. Then if we just use them as a source of information, we might as well use a textbook. And it comes back to some stuff that's been going on for some time. Oops, I think that was me.
There you go backwards, Ben.
Yeah, please. There we go. This idea, Sam Weinberg, I think, does hit the nail on the head when he talks about these two tensions, these two orientations within historical narrative. One reveres the chain of transmission, as he says, passing it on intact, and the other is the one that investigates questions and transition. If you're not familiar, then Richard White, American historian, his book on his sort of family roots, called The Shadow of Akhnagran, is a fascinating story in how his family pressured him into doing the family history, and by the time they finished, they didn't want to hear about it. And I think that this is part of the heart of it. It's understanding about the nature of knowledge and where the knowledge comes from and how we engage with it. And as the British historian lower down there, Professor Terry Hayden says, most secondary kids are or become aware that there are different, but they're less sure that there are different ways of reading history. And I think that's really important. I'm not suggesting that history is as unconstructed, should we say, or unevidenced as a play, but I do think there are activities of analytical processes that in English literature that can be applied to some degree in history as well. Now, I'm just conscious of the time moving on, so I'm going to hand the chair back over to Kevin for a quick rip through some ideas about what we can do.
I appreciate it, and I do want to interject and say again that this PowerPoint will be available to all of our participants after the webinar. Also, a full recording of the webinar, and Libby and I will also work to capture the entire chat. I know many of you are saying wonderful things, and in some cases, it's only coming to us as the panelists, but we'll make sure that everyone gets a full transcript. Kevin, we've got about 10 minutes.
Yeah. So if you want to forward ahead, Andy, sorry about that.
That's all right.
Yeah, I'll make this fast. But I do think that's, you can go 2 forward, I think. I do want to say that one of the things that's, our presentations do have in common, or a theme, if you will, is that we should be asking our students to be skeptical, right? To be cautious about the information that they're confronted with, whether it's on the internet, whether it's a primary source. Getting back to sort of the issue of websites and evaluating websites, like I said before, I think this is not rocket science. This is something that we can, and if we sort of focus on it, if we commit to it, not just in our classrooms this year, but over time, I think this has to start early on, 4th grade, maybe perhaps 3rd grade, beginning to sort of teach our students how to approach online information, on digital information, that over time, perhaps that will impact how they view themselves in relationship to the internet. I could have chosen a much better graphic here, but I think it starts with understanding that what you put into the search engine is going to dictate in large part what you get out of it, right? Whether or not you're searching specifically for EDU websites, whether or not you are putting certain keywords in scare quotes, et cetera, et cetera. The nice thing about this is that you can go to any college or university website and they are going to have information about web literacy, right? They're going to have charts, they're going to have just basic information that you can begin to introduce to your students. Of course, the other issue is how do you integrate that, into your history classroom? I'll get to that in a few minutes, but Andy, if you can forward it.
Sure.
This is just one example that I've used in presentations and even in my classroom, perhaps one of the most popular Black Confederate soldier websites that you'll find. And if you cut and paste the URL at the top, you can of course get access to the website. I think he's still, the owner of this site includes a version of just a musical or instrumental version of John Lennon's song Imagine. So you can have Imagine playing as you go through this website. We don't have a poll for this, but if you want to really just quickly in the chat section, if you were to come across this website, what questions would you ask? What questions would you ask, perhaps should you ask about the information, the overall design that might dictate how you judge what's presented? So who is the author? The most obvious question, right? Is there an author? If there's no author, I think you should probably steer clear. There's probably very little way to vet. The font, I think the font speaks to the overall presentation. Is this a professional website? Or is this the work of someone who got up one morning and said, you know what, I got nothing else to do today. I'm gonna build a website that commemorates the Black Confederate soldier. Authorship. Citations, right. So citations for the content, the accounts that are used, the images themselves. Is it free of an emotional voice, right? Is it editorializing about the past? Who funds it? So you guys are actually really good. So then, of course, that's going to raise the question of to what extent are we teaching our students to ask these very same questions? So Andy, if you, just for the sake of time, if you go to the next slide.
Sure.
Right, so this is a lot of what you just mentioned in the chat section. you can see that played out or written down right here. One way to gain access to the author, if it's not listed, you can go to whoisdomaintools.com. You can plug in the URL of the website. A very easy way to gain access to, to some information about who's publishing that website. And if you do get a name, of course, you can then search for the name to see what kind of qualifications this individual has. When was the site last updated? I don't think this site has been updated in the last 10 years, close to 10 years. The links obviously are absolutely crucial. And of course, I think the other points that you guys are making in terms of links, in terms of funding, et cetera, these are just the obvious ways in which we can, and should be evaluating websites. And it seems to me, and one of the most frustrating things about that whole fake news discussion, especially when it came to websites, was that it didn't seem to me to be that interesting in the sense that we can easily deal with this problem, at least in terms of judging the website angle of it. I mean, yes, Facebook is now supposedly doing that work for us, but that's not Facebook's responsibility, right? That's our responsibility.
So Kevin, I'm going to interrupt you briefly, and I do want to be respectful of the time, and Ben has a couple of concluding questions, but in some ways you've segued from a question I wanted to pose to you, and perhaps Ben could pick it up on a little bit, and that is, the current realization and acknowledgement by all major news sources, traditional news sources, that most American citizens get their news from social media feeds.
That's right.
Which is an entirely different kind of media literacy. If it's not necessarily where the site came from, or what the domain is. It's who in my social network shared this with. Oh, it's crazy Uncle Steve.
Right.
Suddenly, I'm not quite as I don't find it quite as credible.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think the social media adds another layer to this. And I think especially in cases where it's not the crazy uncle, but it's just perhaps someone you grew up with, and maybe the initial thought is, well, why would they intentionally deceive me? At least that might be sort of what's going on underneath without you even noticing, right? But that certainly is. And I had a situation where I tried to explain to a friend that I grew up with that the site he was sharing was an example of fake news, and it resulted in him deleting me. I guess there are certain places where you can have these discussions.
Well, that's the point that Karen just put in the chat box that Ben made earlier, which is essentially you fill your circle only with those people who are confirming the things you want to believe.
That's right.
And our children, our students, are doing this at a level that's well beyond us as adults.
Yeah.
So Eric comments, by the way, Kevin, that he believes that it is Facebook's responsibility, that they're actively writing algorithms that edit and dictate what news will be seen.
Yeah, I think you can go either way on this. There's an argument to be made. From my perspective, however, it's not, maybe I should rephrase it. It's not that I think that Facebook shouldn't take some responsibility for it. It's just that I think the primary responsibility is the user, right? We're the ones who are signing on, creating accounts, and we should be aware of. We should be critically evaluating all the information that we consume. So I don't necessarily disagree with that.
And it seems like what we're all suggesting to our audience, and I think we're hearing in the chat box, is it's not really a choice anymore to teach this kind of literacy and fluency, that in the world we live in, this is a requirement of being an educated young citizenry.
Yeah, I think it's about creating informed citizens. I mean, to me, that was the final point I was going to make, which is that we shouldn't see this just as a matter of teaching a subject, but framing this more broadly. This is what democracy demands now, right? And so this is where we are. I don't know if you wanted me to continue, but
I'll tell you what. If you've, I'm going to ask you to advance through. I'll advance through your slides a little quickly so Ben can wrap up. But tell us about this slide.
I would just really fast, if you can, go online and look for T. Mills Kelly. He created a class a couple of years ago in which he actually had his students, a professor at George Mason University, had his students create fake websites. He wanted to actually show his students how easy it is to deceive the public. And so these students created websites. They had interviews with historians. They created fake Wikipedia pages. They did the whole thing. And it was, again, it was a lesson on just how easy it is to dupe the general public. And this might be an interesting sort of example to share with your students. I tried doing something similar with one of my classes not too long ago. It worked out fairly well. There were some problems with it, but there are also ethical issues involved. But if you forward again, I'll try to get through this and go one more. I would just say, easy ways to just begin to integrate this stuff. Try to find ways to force your students to evaluate the websites that they are using in various projects, whether it's the traditional history paper. Instead of a bibliography, ask them to write, sort of annotated bibliographies that actually trace how they actually arrived, how they arrived at a specific website. Force them to do that work. Whether it's creating a YouTube video, whether it's creating a PowerPoint, ask them, force them to think about where that information is coming from. Because when it comes to publishing these things online for the rest of the world, I think that's where the ethical responsibility comes in, that they actually have to see themselves as sort of publishing, right? They're engaged in the act of publishing, and we want to sort of, I think, reinforce what goes into that, and again, to remind them that, what do they think is necessary for someone else to believe them when they publish? And I think in doing that over time, partnering with your school librarian, with other departments, I think that begins to change, sort of the practice itself. Because I think, you go in there tomorrow with this information, and there's going to be all kinds of resistance, right? Just as there would be with anyone. But I think over time, which is the way this has to happen, I think there's a chance that we can do some good. So I'll stop there, Andy.
Thank you so much. Ben, final thoughts.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah, I'm going to go. Basically, I want to just say two things to kind of round up. Kevin's given us a range of ideas and approaches that can be categorized as digital literacy. I'm going to round up with a slightly more traditionalist view, if you like, which is the single strongest and most powerful defense against a fake news or a fake history account is actually a really good knowledge of the true or the correct or the historically authentic account of the issue in question. In other words, knowing your history is, and then applying that knowledge with confidence is the best way of all somebody to come to a site that they think, what's going on here? Now, obviously, if you don't know that history, then you haven't got them. In most cases, we are talking about subjects that we are teaching, topic areas that we are teaching, and students coming up against versions of these mainstream subjects, whether it's about civil rights or the Civil War or the Roaring '20s or whatever it is. And I've just put in a couple of bullet points here about the idea of disciplinary knowledge. That if students can actually start to engage with this idea that interpretations, my third bullet point in particular, that they are historical interpretations accounts. They are constructed, they're managed, and they're contested. The different periods have different heroes, linked ages. And so, that's my first thing, is understand the nature of what it is that you're looking at and the activity that you're in. And then secondly, turn it around. Turn the fake news idea back on itself. Instead of saying, what is in this account? What can I learn? What is right? What is wrong? Let's flip this around and say, hey, fake news author, what can I learn about you from this source? You see, if we only think of historical accuracy or factual accuracy, then this extract here is effectively useless. It's an account of the Viking attack on Holy Island in 792, and it talks about whirlwinds and lightnings and fiery dragons and so on. But when we look at this, what this does tell us is that this attack has had a huge impact on the people who are writing this thing. And I think that, as I say, we can turn this around by actually sort of saying, okay, guys, look, we can find out about you, the author, from a source, instead of looking for the information in it, why don't we look at our source and say, evidence, this source that we're looking at, is anyone denying something? What does that tell us about the people who've written it? Is anyone belittling something? What does that tell us about the people who've written it? And I think that, we turn the spotlight round back onto the people, or, maybe a better metaphor is we pick the rock up and look for the little crawling creatures that are underneath that have created our fake news. I probably can't end with a better metaphor for fake news than that, can I? Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you also for reminding us here in the U.S. that the historical examples you use are just dwarf ours in terms of length and breadth and depth. You're bringing out examples from the medieval period and from 1792. I cannot thank both Kevin and Ben for leading this conversation. I certainly felt after 90 minutes that we only just began. And of course, all the real good work that needs to happen will be done by you, the participants, who walk into a classroom tomorrow morning and are working with our children to become better citizens in this environment. The National Humanities Centers really appreciates your participation. If you will kindly fill out our evaluation, you'll be able to download your certificate of participation and get credit for being here. Again, Libby will also notify you when the recording of today's session and the chat transcript and the PowerPoint resources are available. It's usually done within a couple of days. And I do want to invite you to join us on the other things that we do here at the Humanities Center. That includes our social media feeds and our next webinar, which will be 2 nights from now, Thursday. It's a rescheduling from a few weeks ago when our lead scholar was ill. We'll be working with David Roble from the University of Oklahoma on how to teach, or I should say Oklahoma University, OU, on teaching John Steinbeck and the Grapes of Wrath and putting it into historical context. Again, thank you so much for being patient with us on this new platform. We look forward to your evaluations on Zoom as our potential platform in the future. We'll also work to iron out all the little tweaks and the kinks that you guys may have seen. I think this is first period for us, and by third and fourth period, we'll have it all nailed down. Thanks again, everybody. Go have a great dinner. Kevin and Ben, I'll see you again soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.